Maybe we can request for people at the back to come forward because we don't have a sound system. We don't have a microphone.
We can hear you.
So we welcome everybody for this public forum organized by the Philippine Press Club of Ontario. We have a very special guest tonight, fellow journalist, who has a very colorful history. Eric Baculinao, when he was a student at the University of the Philippines, I noticed there are UP alumni here. He was the president of the UP Student Council in 1970, and he was there too when the Beijing Commune came up in 1971. He was, for a while, he was a spokesperson of the Kabataan Makabayan. And these were the years when student demonstrations were being held almost every week in Manila. And the peak of the demonstrations was what was called the first quarter storm of 1970. From January to March, almost every week or maybe twice a week, there were demonstrations protesting government policies, protesting the Philippine participation in the Vietnam War, and demanding land reform, lower wages for the workers, and better working conditions for the workers too. Eric in 1971, I think it was August or before August, he was with a group of student leaders. They visited China. I think they were scheduled to visit for about 2 weeks, and then come back to Manila. During those days after they reached China, I believe, or I don't know exactly what date, the writ suspension of habeas corpus came up. It was then President Marcos's first big action before martial law of 1972. So student leaders in his group in China, who were visiting China, could not return to Manila because of risk of being arrested by the military. So they stayed in China to wait for developments. It turned out to be a very long wait. And he would tell the story. I don't want to tell the story. Anyway, he later in China practiced journalism, and years after, he became the Beijing bureau chief of NBC News. And one important thing is when they covered the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, their coverage won an Emmy Award for that coverage. So it's a very, very important recognition for their work in his bureau, Beijing bureau. So what else? Without further ado, I'd like to give you Eric Baculinao.
Thank you, Ernie. First of all, thank you for having me and giving this opportunity to change
notes, especially about China. I'm happy to join in discussions about China because China is becoming more important. Coming from the Philippines, especially, we know that relating with China is most important for two reasons: for our security, we are close neighbors, and also to be more important for our economic development. Because as you know, China is now becoming more second biggest economy in the world, and will become number one, no doubt about it. And will, for our purposes, will become the number one export market for our products eventually. As you know, China is even the biggest trading nation, even bigger than the U.S. So it's not only exporting, but importing more. So from our, especially from my point of view of being concerned always about how we, the Philippines, our country, can catch up and accelerate the dream of, on prosperity. Relating with China is a very important issue. So we'll go back more on that later. But in the meantime, I'd like to clarify that I'm here, not in an official capacity as a bureau chief of NBC News, although I am, I exercise function in NBC, but I speak more to you in my own personal capacity as a kababayan, common interest in China and how we can use that relationship to develop our own country. And therefore, it's basically an informal discussion between us today. If need, no need to attribute anything to my capacity. My company policy is always to seek permission if I have to take position on behalf of the company. So, but that's not really important. The important thing is we have a meaningful exchange about China today. So let me start by before we go to part of the topic one is how the media in China. But before we go to that, let's speak of China today. They just had a transition of leadership. We take China today, we still take on the Communist Party as being the ruling party, despite all the talk of the changes, reform of China joining the global economy and the rise of the middle of private entrepreneurs, the rise of tycoons, Chinese billionaires, millionaires all over. The country still very much remains under the Communist Party leadership. That's a basic fact. That's a starting point in trying to understand China, whether we deal in business, politics, diplomacy. The starting point of trying to understand China as very much under the Communist Party leadership. Despite talk that China has taken the capitalist reform and becoming a capitalist country, the fact is, politically, it still remains under the Communist Party of China, with all the implications it means. And therefore, we talk of the Communist Party going through a continuous change of leadership from time to time that consigns the changes in strategy and programs and focus of the party from time to time. And lately, they have had completed the transition to the 5th generation of leaders, and now represented by President Xi Jinping, who is right now in California holding a summit with President Obama. We'll talk more about that later. But so we are now facing a China that has just completed the second peaceful transfer of power in the history of the Communist China. Because in the past there have been conflicts. The most important conflict is the Cultural Revolution, power struggle, between different factions within the party, so to speak. And so we are now in the era of the 5th generation of leaders. Now, we know Mao founded China, and he was followed by Deng Xiaoping for reform and open up China. And then after that, there were 2 more top leaders until last year, when this new President Xi Jinping took over from Baculinao. Now, Xi Jinping himself will be the leader for the next 10 years. So understanding him, his background, his philosophy, and will be important in understanding China, how to deal with China. Even from the Canada's point of view, from America, from the Philippines point of view, understanding this country, especially the leader, is important. And Xi Jinping is a princeling. His father was a veteran communist revolutionary. So no question about that. He has his background. But he did not, that's an important connection in the context of political position and relationship with China. But he himself tried to rise to the ranks. During the Cultural Revolution, he went to the countryside, this new leader. He stayed, worked with the peasants, stayed in caves, worked, work in the village, and then eventually got a chance to go to the university. So this leadership that we have now, the fifth generation, is probably the most educated leader so far in the Chinese history of Communist Party leadership in China. They have now the first doctorate in the top leadership there now. Well before, from veteran fighters, guerrilla fighters to engineers. Now we have a leadership that has more diversified education with degrees in law, economics, and that is keeping the changing dynamic in the Chinese situation. So it's changing crucial changes in China. So this is the new leader. Xi Jinping as well is the first leader with over whom Deng Xiaoping did not have any influence in selecting. Because the previous two leaders before Xi Jinping was actually chosen by Deng Xiaoping. As part of his reform, he believed these people would carry on with reform. So Xi Jinping, we are still talking with the leaders of New China, the most educated, and in this case, Xi Jinping is probably is immediately the most powerful leader of China after Mao and Deng, because in the structure of the party, nobody was really his patron or children him. He was his father already passed away, and he immediately got the party leadership, the state presidency, and the command of the military, all at the same time in quick succession. And there's no more. So he's an undisputed leader of China. What does it mean? It means that he will have more leeway in leading China in the direction that he thinks would be important. It will be a more decisive leader, but more assertive leader as well. They have changed the Communist Party leadership into a smaller group of 7 standing committee at the top of the political bureau. We used to be 9, so a smaller group is easier to lead. So that's in line with the idea of having a more compact leadership, and Xi Jinping is the center of that. And so we anticipate that China in the next 10 years that will remain under very assertive, very dynamic, very compact, that leadership that will not be paralyzed by factional struggle. That will not be less easily paralyzed by factional struggle, because there will be lesser. In the old days, the bigger committee represented different factions and different mentors and from among the retired. Now we have a more compact leadership, and Xi Jinping will mean that China will become more decisive in dealing with important issues in the world or even at home.